if Britain had fallen, the next thing that the Germans would have seen would have been the skies full of B-36s loaded with atomic bombs.
Between October 1942 and probably May 1943, people were panicking.
Yeah.
There's no doubt.
Is the simple truth that just Germany wasn't ready to take on the might of the Royal Navy in 1939?
If they'd had those 300 U-boats on day one, able to deploy, then they've really got a chance.
Now, if you try and take on the might of the Royal Navy, it never normally ends well. The Atlantic Ocean, a vast expanse of water separating the Americas from Europe and Africa. Over 3,000 nautical miles come between the North American coastline and the English Channel. And during the Second World War, it became home to one of the most unique theatres of battle and the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. From September 1939 all the way to May 1945, both naval and merchant ships were engaged and attacked, resulting in over 100,000 total casualties. Controlling the Atlantic Ocean routes was crucial for the Allied war effort, so the German strategy was simple: sever these routes. Churchill wrote in his memoirs, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Yet, after 5 years and 8 months, the Allies did eventually secure victory. I'm James Hanson. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Battle of the Atlantic, a mammoth sea and air campaign that saw the entire war effort of Western Europe and then the US at stake. Yet what if Germany were able to seize control of this vast expanse? That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as always, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And returning to the channel is the naval historian and YouTuber Drachinifel. Welcome to you both. Now, we have in front of us here a map showing the Atlantic Theatre. So this is from 1942, so around halfway through the war and halfway through the Battle of the Atlantic. Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, just sum up why the Atlantic is of so much strategic importance in this war.
Essentially, the Atlantic is the lifeline that Britain has to the rest of the world. It's fighting at the start of the war an extensive campaign with France at sea. It's trying to blockade Germany and really force it through the same tactics that they used in the First World War to put pressure on its both raw materials and also its economic vitality. Britain also gets most of its raw materials and its food and other trade from the Atlantic itself, not just the North Atlantic, but also the South Atlantic. And of course, it has links to its colonies in Africa and beyond. And were the Mediterranean to become untenable, because Italy, of course, enters the war after the defeat of France, then you've got the Cape route to actually take you to where you get your oil from, Iran, and also the route to India as well. Of course, the problem becomes even worse in 1940 because Hitler invades both Denmark and Norway, and he invades France, which means that the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, can extend its bases not only to the west of France, places like Brest, Lorient, La Rochelle and places like that, but also can operate from Norway and the mouth of the Baltic. So it pushes the front line for the German Navy and the Luftwaffe well forward, so they can not only attack the United Kingdom, but also the routes of trade and also the deployment of warships into the Atlantic and maintaining our connection with America. Now, one of the things that's really important is that we have Canada there, which is one of our dominions. They have a good little professional navy, which expands very quickly. We also have extensive trade and diplomatic links with the United States. And the United States is taking an interest under President Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt tends towards supporting Britain as long as he thinks that Britain can hold out. That's the point. And progressively, we see the Americans themselves taking an interest in the Atlantic, not only to protect their own trade, because some of their ships get attacked, both merchant ships and warships, but also because Roosevelt is trying to lean in and trying to help in a very sort of neutral way Britain to survive. And we can go into some of the detail of that later.
Drac, it's brilliant to have you back on the channel. Welcome back. First of all, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the U-boats that Germany would have had at its disposal at the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, because, you know, I mentioned Churchill's fear of the U-boat peril. What are we dealing with here?
Right, so there are two primary types of U-boat in German service at the start of the war. You have the Type 7, which is perhaps the classic U-boat when people think about what a German U-boat looks like. It's actually for World War II, relatively speaking, small craft, especially for oceanic warfare. And in many ways, it's an updated and revised version of a late World War I German design. But because of its small size, it's relatively quick to produce. The other one they've got is the Type 9, and the Type 9 is a much larger submarine, much better designed for oceanic warfare. It can go further, it can carry more torpedoes, and so on and so forth. But they are both, as well, pretty much all World War II submarines, except for ones at the very end, more surface attack vessels that happen to have the ability to submerge. So they will spend most of their time on the surface running on their diesel engines. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, they also have deck guns as well as torpedoes, and you can carry a lot more shells than you can torpedoes. So if you can catch merchant ships unescorted, then that's the better weapon to use. And the other reason is that while they're underwater, they have to rely purely on their batteries. And while they're running on batteries, at the most they can do maybe 9 knots, which is great if you're already ahead of a convoy and just maneuvering into an attack position. But even a slow convoy will be moving at that speed or a bit quicker. So if you're to one side or the other or behind a convoy, it will just outsail you if you're underwater. So ideally, you want to be on the surface where you can use your big diesels, you can get ahead of the convoy into an attack position, and then you submerge and carry out whatever it is you need to do to try and bypass the escorts and hit the merchant ships. There are a few other smaller submarines, mostly coastal types, which will see service around the UK, but they're by far the minority compared to the Type 7s and the Type 9s. And although there will be some more advanced subs that will come out later on, that's not for a few years.
Chris, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think we've got to see at the start of the war that the U-boat is part of the overall German naval strategy. They're not expecting to go to war in 1939. Hitler has assured Grand Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy, that it's probably going to be about 1941, 1942. And they've got a great plan in place called the Z Plan, which is building up battleships, aircraft carriers, and lots of U-boats as well. We've got to remember that the Germans were only allowed to have, in the Treaty of Versailles, U-boats from 1935 onwards.
Yes.
So the whole fleet has been put together by Captain initially, then Commodore Dönitz. There's only 58 of them at the start of the war, not all of which are operational. And as Drac says, some of them are coastal types, and not many of them are the Type 7 or Type 9. So initially, what the Germans have to do is say, well, what are we going to do here? Now, Grand Admiral Raeder essentially is an old school imperial admiral. He believes in big ships. And he wants to put surface raiders out into the Atlantic to complement the U-boat campaign, at the same time as using the Luftwaffe in its sort of navalized versions, including the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, to do a combined operation. The Germans call it Fox tactics. You know, we're going to do hit and run, we're going to mine and things like that. And at the start of the war, there are already 2 surface raiders out in the Atlantic. The Graf Spee, which comes to grief, of course, down in the South Atlantic, but the Admiral Scheer does really well and sinks a lot of merchant ships. And what we have to do is somehow put together a defence against the U-boats that are out there, that we know are there, and they've struck very early, in fact, and also the threat from these surface raiders as well. And Grand Admiral Raeder throughout is trying to push this line that we need to combine the two. It's not just a U-boat campaign. We've got to get our big ships out there to terrorise the Brits. And he thinks that the new battleships, Bismarck and Tirpitz, that are being built can overmatch anything that the British can put to sea. And of course, that's true on a one-on-one basis. And we'll see later that what the British have to do is actually attach a battleship to every convoy in case they come across one of the big battleships. And there's the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, of course, which are also in play. They're slightly smaller caliber guns, but they're a threat too. But right at the start of the war, there is this tension between Dönitz and Raeder about where the main point of effort should be. And Dönitz has already said, give me 300 U-boats. I can sink 1 million tons of British shipping a month. They've only got 17.5 million tons. Why don't we build more U-boats? But what we have to remember is it's a very young force. They've only been actually in the water since 1935, 1936. Every single one of the people who mans a submarine, not all the captains, have only grown up under the Nazi regime.
Well, look, there is so much to get into here. We call it the Battle of the Atlantic because that's what Churchill dubbed it, but really we're talking about the Atlantic War here. So let's zoom in now and let's talk about the events of the Battle of the Atlantic itself. Hello, Times Radio History fans. Thanks so much for watching and sorry to interrupt. I wanted to really quickly tell you about a brilliant new channel we're launching about the greatest band in history, and I need your help. Unbeatled with Donny Campbell is a new show where every week we go deep on one Beatles song. A historian talks us through all the details before a musician unpicks the lyrics and the music behind hits such as Here Comes the Sun, Penny Lane and Come Together. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to Unbeatled with Donny Campbell on YouTube. If you like history and you like your music, trust me, you're gonna love this. Now, back to Times Radio History. OK, we've got a new map in front of us now. We can't really zoom in when we're talking about a body of water as vast as the Atlantic Ocean, but this gives you a sense of some of the key points in the Battle of the Atlantic. Drac, to start with you, talk to us about probably the most significant early event in the Battle of the Atlantic, which is the sinking of the Athenia in 1939. Why does that matter so much?
So, back in the First World War, the U-boats had tried to operate initially under what was called cruiser rules or cruiser warfare, which was codified in the rules of war of the time, which essentially meant that if an enemy vessel or a vessel heading for an enemy port was spotted, if it wasn't a warship, you were supposed to signal it, tell it to heave to. It could be inspected. If it was carrying what was termed contraband of war, i.e. something that could assist the enemy war effort, then you would tell the crew, right, we're going to sink this ship if you weren't going to capture it. Obviously, U-boat doesn't have the resources to do that. So then the crew would be given time to get off of the ship, and then the ship would be sunk by guns or by torpedoes. Partway through World War I, the Germans abandoned this in favor of essentially a total war where any ship that they found could possibly be sunk on sight, no warning at all. And in some ways, it could be argued that that potentially led to the German defeat because that was one of the key drivers in getting the US involved in World War I. Fast forward to World War II, and technically speaking, cruiser rule warfare is supposed to still be in effect. But when the Athena is hit, she's just hit straight up by a torpedo out of nowhere, no warning, and she starts to sink. So this is a very key moment because it defines to everybody right from the start that the Germans aren't going to be playing by the official rules of sea warfare. They're just going to be blowing ships out of the water left, right, and centre as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, this is the period known as the phony war on land, but I mean, it's very much not when you're talking about the Atlantic.
There are some issues with the Athenia, in as much as that the Germans themselves went, we're not supposed to be doing this. And Fritz Julius Lemp, who is the commander of U-30, is told to alter his logbook, that he hasn't actually torpedoed the Athenia. And the fact that U-30 had actually torpedoed the Athenia doesn't come out until Nuremberg in 1946.
Interesting, yeah.
Because the Germans are so worried about the fact that not only have there been 1,400 people on board, 300 of which are Americans, of which 28 have been killed, that they actually start the war saying, should we really be doing this? So there's a debate at the start of the Battle of the Atlantic as whether cruiser rules should apply. But then they remember, of course, Q ships from World War I, where these are merchant ships, and there are armed merchant cruisers as well, which are merchant ships which have significant armament. And Lemp himself says, possibly excuses being made here. He thought it was an armed merchant cruiser. But the critical thing with the Athenia is it takes 14 hours to sink. So instead of the Titanic losing most of the people on board, most of them actually get off. That's the main point, although 300 are killed and there are ships that actually rescue everybody. The key point about Athenia, it sailed from Liverpool before war had been declared. And it sunk on the first day of the war.
And where exactly on this map does it sink?
It's between Rockall and Tory Island in Ireland, just about here. And as I said, the Germans are uneasy about it. And as I said, it was suppressed at the time because, again, they weren't sure whether they wanted to go for unrestricted warfare at that stage. In fact, the rescue ships, which are seen by Lemp, it's an American ship, the City of Flint, and also the Knutsen, which is a Norwegian ship. So they're neutral, so they don't take part. There's a really interesting link between Lemp and the Battle of the Atlantic, is that later he's in command in May 1941 of U-110. This is U-30. He is brought to the surface, and before the submarine sinks and he drowns, an Enigma machine is captured. A full Enigma machine is captured, and it's thought that Lemp, having got in the water, was trying to swim back and destroy that and the code books. But there's an odd coincidence between this first ship sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic and the absolute key when HMS Bulldog actually captures this complete Enigma machine with the code books and things like that.
Drac, I'm going to bring you in and talk about the first happy time in a moment. But Chris, very briefly, there is a bit of a myth that the convoy system wasn't really introduced until maybe 1941, but you would say actually convoys were around from the beginning of the battle, but maybe just not as effective as they should have been.
Yeah, there are two things associated with convoys. One is they were proved in World War I to be efficient. What didn't happen at the start of the Battle of the Atlantic is people didn't realise that the footprint of a large convoy is actually the same as the footprint of a small convoy when it's in a big ocean like the Atlantic. The other thing at the start of the war is that ASDIC was overestimated in its capability of actually detecting submarines. Ironically, the Germans thought ASDIC, which is the predecessor of sonar, was actually quite good. And what is interesting about the way that Dönitz adopts the tactics is he's got these wolf pack tactics. Now, if you go back into the interwar period, the Germans haven't got submarines. So they think one day we'll get submarines, and you see them throughout the 20s and 30s practicing with their fast torpedo boats. So all the people that are commanding submarines at the start of the Second War have trained in these wolfpack tactics by attacking on the surface in these fast torpedo boats. So when Dönitz says, look, I've got this new idea, we're going to attack on the surface at night, it comes absolutely naturally to the first generation of submariners. So people like Kretschmer, Preen, and people like that are well versed in how to do this because they've trained on fast torpedo boats.
Let's move on to 1940. Drac, tell us about the first happy time. And when we talk about the first happy time, I mean, this is a good time for the Germans. This is when the U-boats are having some luck.
Yes, so as the war goes on, the Royal Navy is commissioning more and more escorts. You've got the Lend-Lease program, which, or basis for destroyers, it's actually technically a slightly different deal to Lend-Lease, but we get 50 old destroyers from the Americans, and the Flower-class corvettes, which are one of the most numerous seagoing escorts, they've actually already been started before the war begins, but they're now beginning to enter service. There's still nowhere near enough escorts, but between air cover and increased escort numbers, it's getting more and more dangerous to be a U-boat captain in what you would call the western approaches just off of the coast of the UK and Ireland. And so they start moving further and further out into the Atlantic. That's not necessarily a good thing on paper for the U-boats because it means obviously they have to burn more fuel to get out into the Atlantic, not really doing a lot while they're there, and they've got to preserve enough fuel to get back home again. But when they end up in the middle of the Atlantic and then eventually in the western part of the Atlantic, they discover two things. Firstly, as we can see on the map, as denoted by these green lines, there's this mid-Atlantic gap where Allied air cover in particular can't reach. So they don't have to worry about bombers and other patrol aircraft coming in and attacking them while they're on the surface, recharging their batteries and so forth. And the other thing is because of the still lack of escort. Convoys are being picked up by escorts in the areas where a combination of experience and intelligence is saying this is the most dangerous part of the sea. This is where we need to protect everybody. And because U-boats haven't shown up considerably further west, a lot of the ships in those areas are either not escorted or potentially not even sailing in convoys. They may be sailing to ports like Halifax to assemble for a convoy. And suddenly the German U-boats are looking around going, lots and lots of targets, virtually no escorts, no air attack to really concern ourselves with it, especially because it's 1940, so the Americans aren't officially in the war yet. And suddenly they're able to sink a lot of targets. So they're on station for a slightly shorter period of time because of the fuel issues, but they're able to expend their torpedoes and use their deck guns in a much more efficient manner.
Chris, how much trouble are the British in 1940 in the first happy time?
They're in quite a lot of trouble in terms of actually defending their convoys, but we shouldn't underestimate the amount of traffic that is actually getting through. This is a vast area, so you can't actually get German Focke-Wulf 200s out here, so they're not doing reconnaissance. So the U-boats are having to do the reconnaissance for themselves. And so when one U-boat detects something, or they pick up a signal from one of these convoys, then they try and concentrate the U-boats on them. One of the big problems the Germans have got initially is their torpedoes aren't very good. And it's not until they get a contact pistol from HMS Seal, which sinks in the Baltic, that they're able to rectify a problem. And that takes till January 1941 to make sure these are reliable. For example, in the Norwegian campaign, they attacked 38 British warships. Only one actually detonated alongside. And throughout the winter of 1940, the Baltic is frozen over. It's a really tough winter, and they can't actually practice or fire their torpedoes. So that's slightly mitigated. As Drac said, you've got these 54-stack destroyers, very old World War I destroyers coming from the Americans. They're being fitted with new ASDIC devices. You've got the new generation of Flower-class corvettes and Hunt-class destroyers. And we've also got Coastal Command with Catalinas and other sort of short-range bombers being converted to this role to try and deal with it. But the fact of life is quite a lot is getting through. And I think one of the things that's really important to understand about the Battle of the Atlantic, if you take it as a whole, only 10% of convoys were attacked by U-boats. And of those that were attacked, only 10% of the ships were sunk in aggregate. Obviously there were casualties greater than that in some convoys. But that's the issue here, is that it was never, ever a situation where this lifeline could be broken completely. And so even in 1940, at this happy time when we're trying to get used to German U-boat tactics, trying to get enough escorts amongst the convoys, the stuff is still getting through. There's another element, of course, we need to consider, is all this time we've got the German surface raiders out. There's a particularly famous raid called Operation Berlin, where Admiral Lütjens goes out with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and basically rampages around the North Atlantic and returns to France, having sunk quite a bit of shipping. And it's meant that we've had to put a battleship with every convoy in case they come across these surface raiders. So the Germans are trying to combine both the surface with the subsurface attack as they're building up their U-boat force. And there's this constant tension, as I said, between Grand Admiral Raeder, who's the head of the Kriegsmarine, and Dönitz, who is saying, look, my U-boat arm is sinking a lot of tonnage here, but not enough. He's got to sink 300,000 tons a month, and that gets very rarely achieved. And when the Americans come in, it's up to 700,000 tons a month. Can't be done.
Well, let's fast forward now to 1941. And Drac, tell us about the sinking or the scuttling of Bismarck, which, of course, is one of the most famous moments, really, in British naval history.
So what the main effect of Bismarck going out to raid, although obviously she can sink quite a lot of merchant ships if she happens to catch a convoy, is not so much the amount of destruction she could potentially do herself. It's the effect that her sailing and deployment into the Atlantic has on all the convoys, because as Admiral Parry mentioned, you've got a battleship with every convoy, but Britain doesn't have that many modern battleships. So a lot of the battleships that are being deployed are older, R-class and so forth. And they're perfectly fine for seeing off the smaller Scharnhorst, but they can't stand up to Bismarck one-on-one. And suddenly you're faced with a possibility of, well, if we don't know where Bismarck is, she could attack any convoy in the Atlantic and potentially take out the battleship escort, plus the smaller escort, plus the merchant ships. And that means that suddenly convoys aren't sailing, convoys are being delayed, convoys are being rerouted. So even if Bismarck had caught a convoy, whatever destruction she might have done to that convoy would actually be, pale into insignificance in terms of the amount of delays to vital goods reaching Britain that would be incurred from all the other convoys that just didn't sail or were delayed for several weeks until she was dealt with. In the event, thanks to a combination of aerial reconnaissance and resistance fighters in Norway, as well as some help from the Swedes, the Royal Navy knows that Bismarck has sailed. She's intercepted by HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales in the famous Battle of the Denmark Strait after being shadowed by HMS Suffolk and Norfolk. The battle isn't actually the one that the Royal Navy wants to fight. They actually have a rather clever tactic of Prince of Wales and Hood being escorted by destroyers, which of course carry their own torpedoes. And the idea is to try and attack at high speed head-on at night, which will maximize the British chances. Unfortunately, HMS Suffolk briefly loses contact with Bismarck, and so you end up with more of a parallel meeting engagement where rough seas cause the destroyers to pull back. Hood is destroyed in that engagement. Prince of Wales is damaged, but she actually manages to damage Bismarck in return, and Prince of Wales is actually the first ship to score a hit in that fight. Prince of Wales falls back, Bismarck heads off. She splits off her escort, Prince Eugen, to try and raid convoys anyway. That doesn't work out because Prince Eugen has machinery issues, as it turns out. But that hit from Prince of Wales means Bismarck is trailing oil. Bismarck is then picked up again by a Catalina, and then she's attacked multiple times by swordfish torpedo bombers from British aircraft carriers. One of those hit the stern, which jams her rudder. So she's now got reduced speed. She's not able to really maneuver all that much, at least in the direction she wants to go, which is back towards France. And so now there's this race between essentially every British ship in the Atlantic that can fight and Bismarck to see, can they intercept her before she gets home? And as it turns out, yes, they can. HMS Rodney and HMS King George V catch up with her. And there's this escalating battle. You've got Ark Royal just over the horizon with the battle cruiser Renown. You've got the cruiser Dorsetshire. You've got a number of other cruisers and destroyers waiting in the wings. Bismarck is harassed the night before by a flotilla of destroyers, including the Polish destroyer Piron, who just sails around in front of her, flashing a signal lamp at her saying, "I am a Pole," to emphasize that she's back essentially for revenge for what Germany's done to Poland. And come dawn, in come the two British battleships. And for all the fact that Bismarck is difficult to actually put down, she's actually rendered combat ineffective in a very, very short amount of time, as depending on which version of events you read, but probably HMS Rodney lands a 16-inch shell hit on top of the conning tower, which knocks out most of her command crew, destroys the forward rangefinders, which obviously affect Bismarck's ability to fire back accurately. And at that point, it's all downhill from there for Bismarck. She's pummeled into the mission. Eventually, she goes down. Whether she's scuttled or not is still a matter of historical debate. But the important thing is, at the end of the day, she has been sunk. And that is pretty much the end of German heavy surface operations, at least as far as battleships are concerned, in the North Atlantic. But even though the Hood has been avenged and everybody's sort of patting themselves on the back for sinking Germany's newest and biggest battleship, as Tirpitz isn't quite ready for service yet, the simple fact is that during all this time, there's been a huge disruption to the convoys, which now can start over, but it gives some idea of some of just the background effects of her mere existence and what she could have potentially done, even if she'd never sailed into the Atlantic again. But if she joined the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau over in French port of Brest, just being there would have massively affected how the convoys would have had to be run from then on.
Chris, there's so much we're trying to pack in here. I mean, just to move the story on, a few things to mention. First of all the while the Enigma code is being cracked. Then you've got, of course, the US coming into the war at the end of 1941. And then in 1942, you have the second happy time. Just talk to us about the significance of those three events.
Yeah, I think it's worth stressing, I mean, the time available, that we were most successful against U-boats when we actually had access to the Enigma code, but there are huge periods when we don't. We capture the first wiring, which Bletchley Park then start to say, look, we can read some of the signals. It's not until Beagle gets hold of an Enigma machine and the code books from U-110 that actually we start reading the signals. The Germans then add a fourth rotor to the Enigma machine. We lose our ability to read an Enigma. And it's not until we capture another one that actually we get on top of that. And all the time that we don't have access to Enigma, you can see a huge spike in losses because we're not tracking where the U-boats are. Later on in the war, we find a way of actually geolocating the U-boats through their transmissions. And that's one of the weaknesses of the U-boats, is they push out a huge amount of information because Admiral Dönitz is a control freak. Every day he wants information from his U-boats. Conversely, the German B-Dienst system is all over our signals intelligence. And in fact, they crack naval cipher number 3, which is all about how you group up convoys. And later, when we have the Americans on board, they're reading all our signals on that, and that helps them in turn. And the Battle of the Atlantic, essentially, is who wins the SIGINT battle. And happily, that is the Allies that managed to do that, because eventually, and it takes 10 months after they think that naval cipher number 3 has been cracked by the Germans, to actually change the code. It's quite extraordinary that we persist with it, even though we see sinking as associated with the intelligence. Nobody thinks of sending out false messages to decoy the U-boats and things like that. But it's not until we get Max Horton and the Western Approaches Tactical Group and School operating out of Liverpool that we start to bring together all the resources that we need to deal with the U-boats. And that's something further down the track. Now, the second happy time for the Germans is, of course, the entry of the United States into the war. And look, and Dönitz has thought about this. If the Germans come in, I'm going to send my Type 9s, my longer distance submarines, to the east coast of the United States, because we reckon there'll be undefended merchant ships there. And he sends a substantial number of U-boats to the east coast and says, right, what I'm concentrating on here is tankers. I want to get tankers. And because they're basically highlighted against the lit shore, nobody thinks about switching off the lights along there. Between the Caribbean, Venezuela and all these other places where the oil comes from, and from the United States, Charleston, places like that, this coastal area becomes a happy hunting ground for Operation Drumbeat, which is this campaign that Dönitz sets up from December 1941. Now, initially, the Americans don't convoy, and Admiral King, who becomes the Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief, gets a lot of stick for this. But the fact of life is, the Americans don't actually have a lot of escorts to be able to do this. He actually gets the army to get aircraft out there. He gets people in cabin cruisers, large cabin cruisers, to go out and look for submarines and things like that. And he says quite emphatically, my emphasis is on protecting troop ships. You know, we've got to sweat this out until we get the escorts. We're fighting a battle in the Pacific. Remember, this is at a time when Pearl Harbor's happened. They're building up to Midway and Guadalcanal, so they haven't got a lot of assets themselves. And there's even a talk of sending some of the 50 Lend-Lease destroyers back to the Americans with ASDIC that they can use in this case. So it's quite desperate, really, for the Americans initially. They get a grip of it. They get a lot of aircraft over the East Coast, and the second happy time then diminishes, and those submarines stay in the area, some of them, but most of them were withdrawn into the mid-Atlantic and into south of the Azores as well.
And then a really key turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic track is what's known as Black May, which is May 1943. So tell us about Black May.
So, as Admiral Parry's mentioned, you've got Western Approaches Command and the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, which is almost entirely staffed by WRENS, the Women's Royal Navy Service. And all during this campaign thus far, what's been happening is kind of a one-upmanship game of tactics. So the U-boats will attack with one set of tactics, and then the escorts will adapt. And that's largely driven by reports which are sent to Western Approaches Command, which then get digested. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit uses them in war games. They figure out, based on the reports of when the U-boats were spotted, where they were spotted, and how they attacked, what their tactics must be. There's then educational courses in Liverpool, which is where most of the convoys are arriving. The escort commanders telling them, okay, this is how you should defeat these tactics. And of course, then the U-boats will change their tactics when they realize those ones aren't working anymore. And thus far, with a few months where it's been bad for U-boats, but a few months where it's been really good for them, gradually the U-boats have been managing to escalate the number of ships that they have been sinking. Some of it's because there's a lot more of them now than there were at the start of the war. Some of it's because of the first and second Havre time. The mid-Atlantic air gap is still there. But when you get to Black May, you see a kind of a culmination of multiple different factors. Obviously, the escorts are more numerous. They're now fitted out with not just the original ASDIC, but also sort of second generation units. They've got radar, and that includes the newer centimetric radar, which can spot periscopes on the surface. You aren't quite seeing the deployment of escort carriers and so forth in the numbers that you would see later on, but newer and more advanced aircraft like the B-24 Liberator are beginning to close the mid-Atlantic gap. And between all of these, particularly just the fact there's just a lot more escorts with commanders who have now been fighting U-boats for years on end, suddenly everything starts to switch over, and U-boat tactics that worked previously are now getting them killed. Again, as Admiral Parry mentioned, you've got HFDF, high frequency direction finding, which is allowing the escorts to work out where the submarines are in real time as they're transmitting. And the simple fact is that if a merchant ship is hit, especially now America's in the war and the Liberty ship program is being built, you can replace a merchant ship. The loss of the cargo is annoying, and of course the loss of lives is tragic, but a merchant ship that's hit will usually have a good portion of its crew survive and ultimately can be replaced. For the Germans, if a submarine goes down, usually that's the whole crew. And if the entire crew is gone and the submarine is gone, and it's taking them 1.5 to 2 years to commission a new U-boat, that's a real decrease in their capability. So they can't afford to trade one-on-one, one U-boat sunk for one merchant ship. They'll run out of U-boats in a matter of months.
And wasn't Dönitz' son on one of the U-boats that went down in Black May?
Yes, yeah. And this is, and the other thing, of course, is the escort commanders, as I said, are getting more and more experienced, but every time an experienced U-boat commander's luck runs out, you're not getting him back. Because, when a submarine is destroyed by depth charges 300 feet down, no one survives that. So the Germans are not only losing subs, but they're also losing the experience and the quality of their U-boat crews. And with the number of U-boats that are sunk in a number of convoy attack operations in Black May, it's suddenly looking like they're trading maybe 1 for 1 or 1.5 for 1 U-boats for merchant ships. And that is a completely unsustainable loss rate. As I said, if they keep doing that, the Germans will be out of U-boats, and the war will be, well, at least the Battle of the Atlantic will be over before the end of the year. So they have to kind of pause, drop back, regroup, reconsider, and try and come up with something new, which is, of course, giving breathing ground for the Allies, because as long as the U-boats have fallen back, the more convoys are getting through, more escorts are coming online, more tactics are being developed, more technologies coming into play, and thus it kind of marks the tipping point after which the U-boats are pretty much consistently on the back foot. They'll bring in new tactics and new technology occasionally, like acoustic homing torpedoes, but it's usually a case of kind of arresting the decline of the U-boat arm temporarily, rather than becoming an ever greater threat the way they had been.
Chris, just to bring you in on this, because you know a thing or two about using aerial power to down a submarine.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning before I do that. Look at 1942. This is when we don't have access to Enigma decrypts, okay? And you've got 110 U-boats at sea operational at any one time during this time. This is before the period of Black May. And Drac is right, everything comes together. You get the Lee light on most of the aircraft that are flying, the B-24s, the Liberators, the Sunderlands and others that are out. You get the Wellington aircraft, which is a long-distance aircraft, and they start attacking U-boats in the Bay of Biscay here. The Germans try and put anti-aircraft guns on their ships. They've got a thing called METOX, which detects radar transmissions. They can dive. But again, because we introduced the ASV-3, which is a centimetric radar in terms of its wavelength, METOX can't detect that. So they're being caught on the surface by this new radar. There's a thing called Hedgehog, which is basically depth charges that are fired ahead of an escort instead of having to drop them over the side. They don't actually explode unless they hit a U-boat, so you're not disturbing the water. The air gap is closed. The escort carriers are yet to come in. And as Drac says, these crews are very inexperienced. You've even got Luftwaffe personnel being told to go to sea as U-boat commanders. By this stage, they're so short of personnel. And we mustn't forget that 3/4 of all U-boat personnel were lost. 30,000 of them were lost at sea. So it's becoming an uphill fight for the Germans. And the fact of life is that aviation really does make a difference. You look at the number of kills at this stage in the vicinity of convoys, it's mostly aviation. Either we've got some ships that essentially have a single Hurricane on board. It launches, it flies around, sees if it can find a U-boat, strafs it. If it doesn't, it ditches alongside. We then have the escort carriers coming in. We have long-range aircraft coming out from Iceland and obviously out here, that's fine. It's true. I am the only officer since 1945 to have attacked a submarine from the air successfully with depth charges in 1982.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you just tell us a little bit more about that?
It's very simple. It was the Argentinian submarine Santa Fe who did exactly what submarines do in those sort of circumstances. We predicted where he was going to be. We caught him just diving with his masts up, put 2 depth charges onto him. We blew the back end off. He started sinking and grounded himself at South Georgia.
Well, there we are. Another reason we're honoured to have you as part of History Undone. Just finally, Chris, any final thoughts on how the battle itself plays out? I mean, really, after Black May, the writing's on the wall, isn't it?
In some ways it is, yes. What Dönitz tries to do is put 4 wolf packs to sea at once to see if he can actually break this. And he can't. You know, the wolf packs don't get contact with any significant convoys. And the fact of life is he's losing personnel. They're losing faith. There is an aspect of this which really is on the human side of things. Now, the problem for Dönitz is he's committed to the tonnage war. So he's trying to clock up the number of tons he sinks. He's not being particular about the targets that his U-boat captains are sinking throughout the war. So a westbound empty ship counts in tonnage terms as much as one that's full coming this way. Now, if you are a U-boat captain, what you're trying to do is achieve 100,000 tons or sink an aircraft carrier or a battleship. If you do that, you get a Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which you wear on your neck like this. Now, it not only gives you a medal, it gives you extensive privileges for you and your family in Nazi Germany. So you go to the front of a queue, for example. You can go first class on the railways and things like that. So there's a tremendous motivation for U-boat captains to go after anything. And the problem is they're not sinking significant targets coming this way. To give you an example, no troop ship is sunk. Now, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, for example, never sail in convoy. The reason is they're doing 28 knots, they're zigzagging, and no U-boat can actually stay up with them. They never get hit. And so it's quite interesting. The motivations of the U-boat commanders and the way they're deployed is absolutely critical. And this becomes even more intense later in the war. And one other aspect of Dönitz's approach to this is, I said earlier, he's a control freak. Every day, U-boats have to transmit on high-frequency radio their fuel state, their torpedo state, the morale, everything like that. So every time they do that, the HFDF, direction-finding equipment, not only on land, but also in the warships at sea, is actually cross-cutting and seeing where the U-boats are. So it's almost self-defeating in that sense. And that gets, again, worse towards the end of the war. So with inexperienced personnel, with aviation virtually covering the areas where the U-boats operate, there's not much hope. However, Dönitz has something up his sleeve. He's got new U-boats coming on stream. And these are one of the wonder weapons that Hitler thinks are going to win the war. They're the Type 21 and Type 23 diesel-electric submarines. The Germans have already introduced the snorkel, which means that they can suck air in and run their diesels underwater, so that minimises their time on the surface. But these new submarines are basically true submarines. They're not submersibles. They can do 21 knots underwater, significant speed. And it's quite interesting that had they got them into the war earlier, they didn't really get everything sorted out before the end of the war, there would have been a significant difference, because all the technologies that we've been using up to that point and bringing together actually would have been less effective.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and maybe that's something to consider in our next section, because what we're going to do now, and kudos to you both, you've done a great job of summarising what is a vast Atlantic war. What we're going to do now is what we love doing on History Undone. We're going to ask ourselves, could the Battle of the Atlantic play out differently? And if it had, what might the long-term consequences have been? This is History Undone. OK, well, let's ask ourselves, first of all, could the Battle of the Atlantic been won by the Germans had it kind of played out differently, had they approached things differently? Drac, to start with you, is there anything really that the Germans could have done to give themselves a better chance of winning the Battle of the Atlantic?
There's a few different ways they could have approached it. A lot of it depends on what you want to define as your sort of point of departure, because what the Germans could have done better, let's say, had they started departing from history in 1936-37, is very different to what they could have done in, say, 1943. As Admiral Parry's already mentioned, there was this whole conflict between, do you want a big surface fleet or a big U-boat fleet in the case of, they've got limited resources, so they can't have both. And they try for both and end up with neither. So you could argue, well, in the run-up to the war, if somebody had gone, actually, you know what, we're just going to stick with the Königsbergs and the Deutschlands, the stuff we've inherited from the Reichsmarine before Hitler took power, and we're just going to build as many U-boats as humanly possible, then that could have had a very serious effect early on in the war, when most of the measures that we've just been discussing weren't really in place. And just having a lot more U-boats out there could potentially have escalated things to a pretty bad level. And the flip side is that at the other end of the war, again, as was mentioned, you've got the Type 21s and the Type 23s coming in, the Electra boats. However, they are actually a secondary effect of a different program, the water-powered, hydrogen peroxide-powered Type 17s and Type 18s, which the Germans have been working on pretty much throughout most of World War II. And there's just so many issues with hydrogen peroxide-powered submarines that eventually it doesn't really lead anywhere in the war. And, for anyone who has a basic knowledge of chemistry, the phrase 80% proof hydrogen peroxide will send you running for the hills, but that's what they're trying to use as fuel. But eventually, in 1943, they end up looking at the plans, and someone goes, well, why don't we take this big hydrogen peroxide boat, the Type 18 we've been designing, and just replace the hydrogen peroxide fuel with loads and loads of batteries, and that's how you end up with the Type 21. So if someone had perhaps recognized that the water turbine really wasn't going anywhere far much sooner, given that the Type 18 design was prepared a lot sooner, they could potentially have looked at that and gone, hang on, let's turn this into a diesel electric boat. And instead of having, one, maybe two operational right at the very end of the war in May 1945, they could have had considerably more of them in service and out in the Atlantic maybe a year and a half earlier, which, again, as was mentioned, that could have made a very, very serious difference, because apart from anything else, the underwater speed of a Type 21 was in excess of the maximum surface speed of a lot of Allied escorts at the time. So it wouldn't have been a case of we've been detected, dive and hope that we don't get depth charged or that we can evade them. It would have been a case of, oh, they detect us, that's fine. We'll just motor on away and there's nothing they can do to catch us. There were a very limited number of mid-Atlantic escorts that could have overhauled a U-boat doing 18 to 21 knots underwater.
Chris, is the simple truth that just Germany wasn't ready to take on the might of the Royal Navy in 1939?
Well, Grand Admiral Raeder said that on day one of the war. You know, all we can do is go down fighting and hope that our reputation will take us through into the future. He actually says that, you know, we don't stand a chance. And he was expecting to go to war much later. There's no question about that. And that's what Hitler had assured him. So there was a real problem in that respect. As I said, only 58 U-boats. Most of those were coastal ones. If they'd had those 300 U-boats on day one, able to deploy, then they've really got a chance. But there's another critical area, air cover. There was an ongoing battle between Raeder and Goering about who controlled aviation over the sea, something which Goering won. And the fact of life is they didn't devote enough attention to naval aviation. They had the Focke-Wulf 200 Condors, long range. They could go out virtually to where Bismarck was sunk. In fact, they tried to rescue Bismarck by sending these out. And a destroyer was sunk the day after, one of our destroyers was sunk the day after Bismarck was sunk by one of them. It was bombed. So they failed to cover their U-boat operations with both reconnaissance and strike assets. One thing worth mentioning, there were 32 Italian submarines in the Atlantic.
Yes.
17 of which were lost, and they achieved a striking rate which was roughly similar to German U-boats over the course of the war. But again, the Italians didn't contribute aviation to that. And what the Germans failed to do was mirror image, saying, well, this is what the Allies are doing to us, so what can we do to them? The other area I think they could have done a lot more was mining. Mining's a cheap option, by aviation or by U-boat, and it would have taken a tremendous effort to keep basically the western approaches clear of mines, because you've got to dock somewhere. You can't actually stay out here. And so there's a real problem in the German Navy because it's run by big ship admirals. One of the things that Dönitz does when he comes in as head of the Navy in 1943, he has a thing called the Cull of the Seals. And it's basically getting rid of all these big ship admirals. And Hitler's lost faith as well. I mean, really interesting, on the Bismarck deployment, if that had succeeded and Bismarck and Prince Eugen had managed to get amongst the convoys and returned, it would have proved the system of getting out there with these ships that the Royal Navy couldn't cope with unless they got an aircraft carrier in there. Interestingly, Admiral Lütjens is probably the one in the Bismarck is the most talented German general. There's no question about that. And before he goes, he says, look, this is only going to work if I don't get detected in the Denmark Straits or going through the gap there, and he is, by a ship that is HMS Suffolk that has only just been fitted with radar. So they didn't know that. And secondly, if I don't come across British aircraft carriers. And Hitler says afterwards, Lütjens told me about the aircraft carriers. You know, this is absolutely boneheaded. And here's the thing, Raeder didn't even bother telling Hitler that Bismarck had sailed. And Hitler's really upset that they've wasted all this material and this manpower, and they haven't actually told him. And he berates Raeder for the fact they didn't sink Prince of Wales. But interestingly, that wasn't Lütjens' orders. He was told to avoid combat with ships of equal power and get out into the Atlantic and sink convoys. So he's very reluctant to engage with Hood and Prince of Wales, but he's forced onto it because they're coming onto him. So had they actually combined better their surface fleet with their U-boats and provided the air cover that was so necessary to prevent their U-boats getting attacked by aircraft, you might have seen a different result. But at the end of the day, you're talking about the Americans coming in 1941, it was all over.
It was all over at that point,
Yeah, because as Drac says, you know, they're outbuilding any sinkings that you can do. I mean, the Americans contributed 38.5 million tons of shipping, and essentially, how many did the Germans sink? 14 million tons. You're nowhere near it.
And ultimately, if the aim of it is to starve Britain out of the war, I mean, that doesn't happen because the harvest in Britain is better in 1941 than it was in 1940, better in 1942 than it was in 1941. Briefly, as with everything in World War II, doesn't Hitler's ineptitude as Commander-in-Chief play a role as well? Because didn't he also deploy loads of U-boats to the Mediterranean when, frankly, they'd be far better off in the mid-Atlantic?
There are issues. Because Rommel's supplies are being intercepted by both submarines and surface ships from Malta, he he says to Dönitz, and we need submarines in the Mediterranean, the Italians aren't hacking it. And so you need to do that. Dönitz is furious. It is not critical, though. It simply reduces the coverage that the U-boats have got further out. But the fact of life is that if you get a situation where, look how constrained you are. The United Kingdom is a huge bung in the plug hole that is the exit from which the Germans have to come. So that in itself, the geography, is a real problem for both surface ships and indeed U-boats deploying. And as soon as we get extensive air cover here, then these U-boats deploying from the west of France, it's very difficult indeed. Hitler himself had good instincts about the Navy. The deal that Raeder had actually put in place is, he said, look, I've been running the Navy since 1928. Keep the party out of the Navy and I'll ensure the Navy behaves itself. Because one of the things that Hitler was paranoid about was another mutiny like in 1918 by the Navy. He talked about it often. And the deal was that the party wouldn't interfere. But Hitler's instincts were actually quite good, by and large. When he talks about Hood and Prince of Wales, he said, why didn't we finish off the Prince of Wales? We had the chance to do that. But of course, Lutyens is thinking, I've just lost 1,000 tons of fuel. I'm not going to make it back to Norway. He's got other things to worry about at that point. But Hitler, there's a very famous diary by Walter Huell, who was Ribbentrop's liaison officer to Hitler. And Hitler goes an extensive rant about what went wrong and why the Navy shouldn't have deployed Bismarck with just Prince Eugen. And he actually says, why didn't Scharnhorst and Gneisenau go? Well, the answer was that they weren't fit to go to sea. And Lutyens himself said, why don't we wait for Tirpitz? We can go together. So again, the Germans aren't concentrating force at our weakest points.
Drac, go with me on this. Let's say that the Germans managed to starve Britain out of the war. Let's say that they succeed in their primary objective in the Battle of the Atlantic. Talk me through the consequences for the rest of the war.
Well, if Britain is starving to the point that they're forced to seek terms, there are a few different options. Of course, you have Churchill's famous speech where he talks about, even if this whole island was subjugated and starving, the rest of the British Empire, guided by the British fleet, would carry on the fight. And it's possible that could indeed have happened. I mean, there's precious little that the Germans can do to somewhere like Canada. However, it's probably better, ironically enough, for the Germans that didn't happen. Because, again, as Admiral Parry mentioned earlier, one of the things that the Americans were a bit worried about was whether or not Britain would be able to sustain itself in the fight. And although they were perfectly happy to back us up and provide, escorts and support, and then once obviously the war get involved, they get involved in the war, then they're in there as much as we are. But they have a backup plan. Well, they have several backup plans, and one of those backup plans is known as the B-36. So, of course, we all know about the B-29 that dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ended the war in the Pacific. But the B-36 originates at around about the same time, early on in the Second World War. And the brief is essentially, if Britain falls, America wants to have bombers capable of flying all the way across the Atlantic and, at the start of the war, dropping conventional payloads on Germany and German-held territories, because they recognize that if Britain does fall, Hitler's unlikely to stop there. So if Britain had fallen, then it's very, very possible that 46, 47, maybe early 48, as and when the war drags on, the next thing that the Germans would have seen would have been the skies full of B-36s loaded with atomic bombs, which would have been a much worse situation for everybody on mainland Europe than even the historical level of devastation we got from conventional war. And that's before we get into some of the rather darker plans that Churchill and the British military had come up with, like Operation Vegetarian, which were kind of your last-ditch break glass in case of emergency weapons and plans that they come up with. Not really ending very well for anyone there.
Chris, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to get this in perspective. 95% of all the sailings for Britain during the Battle of the Atlantic actually made it safely across. Yeah. I mean,
So they didn't come remotely close to winning. Yeah.
I have to say, though, between October 1942 and probably May 1943, people were panicking.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. You read the politicians' diaries and all the official accounts. That is when they're getting really worried, because the number of sinkings is going up. Number of U-boats at sea is at its maximum at that time. So it depends on your perspective. But if you look at the statistics of it and the operational analysis, the Germans can never come near. Now, as I said, if you'd managed to bring all the elements together, you'd have had a chance earlier on, 40, 41, sometime like that. But they never had the resources. What's really interesting is the Germans expended more raw materials and material on their navy than they did on every single vehicle they produced for the German army.
Wow.
If you think of that.
Yeah.
And so when Hitler was thinking about the loss of the Bismarck, he wasn't thinking about the crew. He was thinking about all the material that had been lost in that big ship. And he expresses it in those terms. And his adjutant at the time said, I thought it was a bit cynical, actually. You can see it in his diary. But the issue here is that the Americans would have brought, once they dealt with the Japanese, would have then faced this way and said, right, where is our leading edge now? And that's going to be in the mid-Atlantic. And it's going to take a number of years for the Germans to build up a navy that is sufficient to take on the Americans in the Atlantic, because the German focus would have been on acquiring colonies. At the end of 1940 and into 41, the German Navy is talking about a huge new German empire where they've taken colonies off the French and off the British, how they're going to build huge numbers of battleships and cruisers to patrol the oceans. And so their focus is going to be elsewhere. The Americans can wait. And of course, the Americans are involved in the Pacific by this stage. And I think what would have happened is the Americans would have gone Pacific first. The Germans come across the Atlantic. This is a huge 3,000-mile moat. We mustn't forget that. Just on Drac's point about the nuclear devices, during the Cold War, of course, the threat from Soviet submarines was such that we were going to use nuclear depth bombs to be able to deal with them. I even flew missions myself that actually simulated that. We had a simulator that went through it, and you had to run away pretty fast if you were in a helicopter, I can tell you, in the right way. But our plan there, and the Americans basically said, if we have to reinforce Europe, we will drop nuclear depth bombs anywhere we think there's a Soviet submarine. And that was the plan.
Well, look, gentlemen, this has been absolutely fascinating. I mean, frankly, when you're talking about the Atlantic War, I mean, we need hours really to do it justice. But thank you both so much. This has been genuinely, absolutely fascinating. And I think we can probably say, look, the Battle of the Atlantic probably was never going to be won by the Germans. If you try and take on the might of the Royal Navy, it never normally ends well. And as a maritime nation, Britain always had a certain advantage. But there are scenarios in which Germany maybe could have inflicted more damage on the Allied war effort had it got its act together, had Dönitz been listened to more by the German High Command. There is also a scenario, let's just say hypothetically, in which Germany somehow manages to starve Britain out of the war, as Drac outlined, where maybe the war drags on into 1946, 47, 48, and you end up with atomic bombs being dropped on Germany. So some really big long-term consequences potentially stemming from the Battle of the Atlantic. But I think the lesson today, which is a lesson we know from history, don't mess with the Royal Navy. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Drachinifel and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.